She stepped off the plane smiling, heart full of dreams, clutching a letter from the man who promised her love. But within minutes, she was rejected, because of the color of her skin. Stranded in a foreign land, humiliated in front of hundreds, she thought it was the end. Until a quiet man in dusty boots stepped forward, looked her in the eye, and said 5 words that would change everything. Who is this man? And why does he see something in her that no one else did? Amora stood at the airport terminal, clutching a faded envelope with trembling hands. The air buzzed with noise, arrivals, greetings, goodbyes, but her eyes searched desperately through the crowd for one specific face. She had memorized his photo, studied every word of his letters. Her dress, though modest, was chosen with care, and her suitcase carried the only belongings she could afford to bring from Lagos. She had given up her job, her apartment, and even sold her grandmother's necklace just to pay for this ticket. She was here for a new beginning, and for a man named Richard, a middle-aged American who had written poetic words of love to her through the International Bride Agency. When she finally saw him, a tall man in a baseball cap holding a sign with her name, her face lit up. She waved, took a few steps forward. But his expression changed. First confusion, then irritation, and then disgust. He lowered the sign, looked her up and down, and said loudly enough for others to hear, "You didn't tell me you were black." The words hit her like a slap. She froze, stunned. She opened her mouth to explain, but Richard turned away and walked off, muttering that he'd been catfished. People stared. A few laughed. A security guard stepped in to ask if she needed help. Amora nodded, tears welling in her eyes, trying to stay composed. She was alone in a strange country, rejected not for who she was inside, but for the color of her skin. With no money, no return ticket, and nowhere to go, she sank onto a cold bench just outside the terminal, humiliated and overwhelmed. All she had left was her suitcase, her pride, and a shattered dream. She watched couples embrace and families reunite, wondering how everything had gone so wrong so fast. What she didn't see was the man leaning against a pillar nearby, watching her quietly. He had seen the entire thing unfold, every cruel word, every look of pity from the crowd. He didn't know her name yet, but something in her posture, in the way she held herself despite the shame, reminded him of something. No, someone he had lost long ago. And in that moment, as snowflakes began to drift down from the overcast sky, he stepped forward, not knowing that this single decision would change both their lives forever. John Caldwell didn't stand out much in a crowd. He wore old jeans, a flannel shirt tucked neatly into a worn belt, and a brown coat that had seen too many winters. He wasn't the kind of man people noticed, and he liked it that way. At 63, with salt and pepper hair under his cap and deep lines around his eyes, he had made peace with being invisible. But that afternoon, as he stood near the airport exit waiting for a tractor part shipment that got rerouted, he couldn't look away from the scene unfolding just a few feet from him. He'd seen the girl first from behind, standing so straight, so hopeful, and then he watched as the man walked up and shattered her with just a few careless words. John had seen cruelty before, but something about this felt especially cold. She didn't cry. She didn't shout. She just stood there, holding that torn envelope like it was the only thing keeping her from falling apart. When she finally sat down alone, the ache in John's chest surprised him. It was a feeling he hadn't felt in years, an ache that came from watching someone treated like they were less than human. It reminded him of his wife, Miriam, of the battles they fought together, of the things they lost. John waited until the crowd thinned. Then he walked over to her, slowly, carefully, like he was approaching a frightened animal. Up close, she looked even younger than he expected, maybe in her late 20s. Her eyes were wide, dark, and searching. "You need a place to stay?" he asked, voice low, unsure if she'd even answer. She looked up at him, confused. He held up his hands like he wasn't a threat. "I saw what happened. I've got a place. Out of town. Big property, no strings." She blinked. "Why?" she asked, voice hoarse. John hesitated. "Because no one should be left sitting alone like that. Not in a place this cold." There was a long silence before she nodded slowly. That was all. No details exchanged. No promises made. Just a quiet agreement between two strangers. The drive was silent. Amora stared out the window, her face blank but her fingers clenched tight around the strap of her bag. John didn't ask questions. He didn't try to talk. He just drove. His pickup truck rumbled down long roads, past rows of bare trees and snow-covered fields. The further they got from town, the more Amora's shoulders tensed. Finally, as they pulled into the long dirt driveway that led to his farmhouse, she whispered, "This is your land?" John nodded. "Most of it. Hasn't seen much life since my wife passed." The farmhouse was simple but clean, with a large barn to one side and chicken coops near the back. The porch creaked under their feet as he led her inside. Guest rooms down the hall. Bathrooms shared. "I'll cook. You eat if you want. You leave if you need to. That's it." She said nothing, just looked around slowly, taking it all in like someone dropped on another planet. That night, John sat at the kitchen table staring at the steam rising from his coffee. He could hear the faint creak of the floorboards upstairs as Amora moved around, probably not sleeping. He thought about the stares he'd get in town. About the whispers. About Miriam. She would have done the same thing, he told himself. She would have opened the door without a second thought. He hadn't helped anyone in years, hadn't let anyone in since her passing. But something about that girl, it cracked the shell he'd built around himself. He didn't know what she needed. He didn't even know her name until he saw the envelope again, still clutched in her hand as she slept sitting up. Amora. He whispered it to himself like it was sacred. The next morning, she was up early, already outside watching the sunrise over the frozen fields. John handed her a cup of tea without speaking. She nodded in thanks, still unsure of him. Still holding herself like she was waiting for the world to turn on her again. John didn't push. He just sipped his tea and looked out across the land. Two people, strangers from different worlds, standing side by side in silence. That moment, like so many that followed, was small and simple. But it was the start of something neither of them could name yet. In the first few days, Amora kept her distance. She barely spoke unless necessary, and every movement seemed calculated, like she was trying to stay invisible even in an empty house. She ate meals quietly, cleaned up after herself without being asked, and avoided eye contact. She had been humiliated in front of strangers, taken in by another, and now lived in a house that wasn't hers, in a country she didn't know. Every part of her felt foreign. Even the way the wind moved through the trees sounded different than back home. But she watched John. He didn't pry. He spent most of his time outside, tending to the farm, feeding the animals, and fixing the fence that had been falling apart since the last winter storm. He'd offer her food, always placing her plate gently on the table, and then leave her to eat. He never once asked about her past or her plans. That silence became a strange kind of comfort. She didn't trust him yet, but his quiet patience began to feel safer than the fake kindness she had met in those online letters. One morning, Amora stepped outside to find John wrestling with a broken water pump. His face was red from the cold, hands wet and shivering as he muttered under his breath. Without thinking, she walked over and knelt beside him. "You're doing it wrong," she said. He blinked, surprised. "You know how this works." She nodded. Back home, her uncle had taught her about plumbing systems. She took the wrench from him, adjusted a few valves, and within minutes, the water sputtered back to life. John chuckled. "Guess I needed the help," he said. She didn't smile, but for the first time, her shoulders relaxed. From that moment on, Amora began stepping into the rhythm of the farm. She helped feed the chickens, gathered eggs, and even rode into town with John to pick up supplies. The townspeople stared. Some were polite but cold. Others whispered as she passed. She pretended not to hear, but she heard everything. At the diner, a waitress served her coffee without a word, placing the cup on the edge of the table like she didn't want to get too close. A man in the corner laughed and said something under his breath that made John's jaw clench. Amora saw his hands tighten around the coffee mug, but he didn't say anything. On the ride home, she asked, "Why do you let them talk like that?" He looked out at the road and said, "Because I used to be like them. Until someone made me better." She didn't ask who. But that night, while putting away the dishes, she found a photo on the fridge. A smiling woman with wild red curls stood next to a younger John. They looked happy. Really happy. "Your wife?" she asked. He nodded. "Miriam." Then he added, "She saw people the way they really were. Even when I couldn't." That was the first time Amora truly saw the loneliness behind his eyes. As days turned into weeks, the routines between them started to feel natural. They worked together in silence, shared meals without awkwardness, and sat in the evenings on the porch without needing to fill the air with words. But one afternoon, as Amora was cleaning out the barn, she found a box tucked under a stack of hay bales. Inside were letters, old, yellowing, and tied together with a ribbon. Curious, she flipped through them. They were adoption letters, all denied. One in particular stood out. It was addressed to John and Miriam, declining their request to adopt a young black boy from an orphanage in Louisiana. The reason? Unsuitable placement due to social concerns. The words made Amora's stomach twist. She realized that Miriam had fought for that child, and likely faced the same kind of quiet racism Amora now experienced in town. That night, she confronted John. "You tried to adopt," she said softly. He nodded, not surprised she had found the box. "We tried 3 times. They always found a reason to say no. But that last one, he was special. Miriam never got over it." Amora asked what happened to the boy. John looked out the window and said, "We don't know. The system lost track of him. We grieved him like a child we never got to meet." Amora said nothing. But for the first time, she saw something deeper in John, not just kindness, but sorrow that had shaped him. In a strange way, their pain ran in parallel. They were both rejected by people who never gave them a chance. A week later, Amora found herself humming while baking cornbread in the kitchen, something she hadn't done in months. When John walked in and smiled at the smell, she actually smiled back. She helped him fix a fence post later that day, and when she slipped in the mud, he laughed, a warm, real laugh. She laughed too. It was the first time in a long time that it felt like more than survival. Something was blooming, quiet but real. But under that, there was still uncertainty. Was she just a symbol to him? A way to heal an old wound? Or was she truly becoming part of something? The question lingered in the silence between them as spring began to break through the frost. The day started like any other, with the sun rising behind the hills and the sound of roosters cutting through the early silence. Amora was out in the chicken coop while John repaired a broken hinge on the barn door. They barely spoke, but there was ease in the way they moved around each other now, like a rhythm had settled between them. The warmth of spring had started to touch the land, melting the last of the snow and bringing soft green back to the fields. Amora had begun planting a small garden behind the house, using seeds John said had been sitting unused for years. Life was beginning to feel less like something borrowed and more like something she was quietly building, one morning at a time. But that evening, as the sun dropped behind the hills and the wind picked up, everything changed. It started with smoke. At first, Amora thought it was just someone burning leaves nearby. But then she saw the black trail rising fast from behind the barn. She dropped the pail she was holding and ran, heart pounding, feet kicking up dirt. Flames were already licking up the sides of the barn by the time she got there. The dry wood caught fast. Inside were bales of hay, old tools, and the tractor John had spent weeks restoring. She screamed his name. He came running from the fields, eyes wide, and when he saw the fire, his face turned pale. Without thinking, he rushed toward the barn, but Amora grabbed his arm. "It's too late," she yelled. "We need water." Together, they worked with the old pump and garden hoses, trying to slow the flames until the fire truck arrived. But by the time the local volunteers doused the last of the embers, the barn was half collapsed and the inside burned to ash. A crowd had gathered by then. Neighbors who rarely came around stood whispering on the edge of the driveway. One woman muttered, "Wasn't burning before she came." Amora heard it. She always heard it. And this time, so did John. He turned sharply and stared the woman down, his jaw tight. She looked away, but the damage was done. The chief fireman stepped forward and pulled John aside. "No lightning. No accident. Looks like someone set it. Could be faulty wiring, but we found this." He held up a charred matchbook. It had a diner's name on it, one from town. John's eyes flicked to Amora. She saw it. Just for a second, doubt. It hit her harder than the heat from the flames. He didn't say anything. He didn't accuse her. But he didn't defend her either. That night, she sat in her room and stared at the ceiling, wondering if everything she thought was growing between them had just gone up in smoke. 2 days passed. The air around the house changed. John was quiet, more distant than usual. He worked longer hours, didn't come in for lunch, and barely looked her way when he did. Amora felt like a stranger again, her skin heavier on her bones. Then one afternoon, while cleaning the shelves in the hallway to stay busy, she noticed something wedged behind a stack of old books. It was a thin envelope, sealed but yellowed with age. On the front, written in faded ink, was Miriam's name. Amora hesitated, then opened it. Inside was a letter, written in careful cursive. Miriam spoke of the boy they tried to adopt. Of how her heart broke when the agency told them a black child would never be safe in their town. She wrote about the loneliness that followed. About how she wished the world could be different. About how she believed John had a better heart than the people around them. Amora stood there shaking. She read the letter twice, then a third time. It wasn't just about the boy. Miriam had written something else. If you ever find someone the world doesn't accept, bring them here. Let them feel peace, if only for a while. This land is more than soil, it's meant to heal. Amora sat down, her eyes stinging. She realized then that John's kindness wasn't about pity. It wasn't about replacing what he'd lost. It was about something Miriam had asked him to do, something he was trying to live up to, even if he didn't fully understand it. That night, she placed the letter on the kitchen table. She didn't say a word. She just left it there. John found it after dinner. He sat at the table for a long time, reading it under the soft light of the kitchen lamp. When Amora walked in to refill her water, he looked up at her. His face was softer. "I should have believed you," he said quietly. "About the fire. I didn't say anything, but I thought it. I'm sorry." She nodded, not because it fixed everything, but because it was real. He asked where she found the letter, and she told him. Then, as the wind howled outside, he shared something he had never told anyone. Miriam used to say that people only grow when they're forced to reckon with their own silence. I've been silent for too long. The next morning, John called the fire department again and insisted they investigate the diner where the matchbook came from. By evening, news came back. A teenager had confessed to starting the fire on a dare, thinking the barn was empty. John told the town. He told them Amora had nothing to do with it. Some apologized. Most didn't. But the silence from John had ended, and that made all the difference. For Amora, the scars from that fire weren't just on the land, they were inside her. But as she stood on the edge of the burned barn with a hose in her hand, she didn't feel like a guest anymore. She felt like someone who had earned her place. The days after the fire passed slowly, each one marked by small changes neither of them could name. John fixed what he could around the property while Amora stayed busy with the garden, determined to bring something new into the space where so much had been lost. The burned barn remained untouched for now, its charred frame like a shadow over the field. Neither spoke about rebuilding it. They didn't need to. Something had already been rebuilt between them, quiet but strong. Yet underneath that calm, questions still stirred. For Amora, it was the doubt that had taken root when John first looked at her with suspicion. For John, it was the feeling that he was walking too closely in the footsteps of Miriam's wishes, not his own. They hadn't spoken about the letter again, but its words lingered in everything they did, in every shared glance, every cup of tea passed silently across the table. One afternoon, while Amora was reading in the sunroom, a knock came at the door. John answered, and a man in a suit stepped in, holding a notepad and a camera slung around his shoulder. He introduced himself as a local journalist writing a piece on rural diversity and had heard the story about the farmer who took in a rejected bride. Amora froze when she heard it. The journalist asked for a photo, a quote, maybe a sit-down interview. John's expression was calm, but Amora could see the tension in his hands. She stepped into the doorway and said, "I'm not a story. I'm a person." The man smirked and shrugged. People love feel-good stories. You'd be surprised what a photo and a happy ending can do for small towns. John asked him to leave. He did, but not before snapping a photo of the house and muttering that someone would publish something, with or without their help. That night, Amora sat on the porch, legs pulled up to her chest. John joined her, and after a while, he said, "He's not wrong, you know. People eat it up. The old man and the girl he saved. That's the headline." She didn't say anything. The wind was cold, even with spring in the air. Then she asked the question that had been burning inside her for weeks. "Why did you take me in?" He looked at her, not surprised. "Because I saw someone who didn't deserve to be left behind." She nodded slowly, then asked, "But did you see me, or did you see what you lost?" John's face didn't change, but his voice dropped. "At first, I saw Miriam. I won't lie. I saw what she would have done. But you're not her. And this isn't about her anymore." Amora stared out into the dark. "So what is it about now?" He took a breath. "It's about what I feel when I look at you. Not guilt. Not duty. Just you." The silence that followed was heavier than usual. Amora stood and walked down the porch steps, stopping at the edge of the gravel path. "I can't be a stand-in for someone's grief," she said. "I've done that before. It almost broke me." John didn't follow her. He stayed sitting, hands folded. "I don't want a stand-in," he said quietly. "I want you. Because you make this place feel alive again. Because when I see you smile, I feel something I thought I buried years ago." She turned, looking at him in the moonlight. "Then prove it. Not with words. With truth. With something that's just for us. Not for a headline. Not for the people in town. Just us." The next morning, John drove her into town, not to the store or the diner, but to a quiet lawyer's office on the edge of the square. There, he handed her a folder. Inside were documents, papers that named her part owner of the land. Amora looked up at him in shock. "You're giving me your farm." He shook his head. "No. I'm sharing it. Because this isn't mine anymore. Not if you're in it." She signed the papers slowly, with tears she didn't even realize had come. It wasn't about land. It was about belonging. It was about choice. But as they stepped back outside, a man across the street snapped a photo. The next day, it ran on the front page of the town paper with the headline, "Local Farmer and African Bride Share Land, Share Future." The article painted it as a romance, a tale of redemption and small-town progress. Strangers started stopping by the farm, some bringing gifts, others just wanting to see the miracle couple. Amora hated it. Every smile felt like a mask. Every compliment was soaked in curiosity and subtle judgment. She wasn't a display, and John knew it too. One evening, as a car pulled into the driveway uninvited, John put up a sign by the road. It said, "Private property. No stories here." Inside the house, away from the noise, they sat together on the couch. John reached for her hand. "I don't care what they say," he said. "Do you?" Amora looked at their hands, his calloused and worn, hers still marked by the fire. "I care about what comes next," she whispered. "And whether it's real." John leaned in, forehead resting against hers. "It's real. If you want it to be." The moment was quiet. No music. No speeches. Just truth. Word spread quickly in the small town. First it was just whispers at the market, then a printed notice at the post office. John Caldwell, the quiet widowed farmer, and Amora, the mail-order bride who was once rejected at the airport, were getting married. Some people were curious. Others were outright angry. There were rumors that she was after his land, that he was too old to know better, that the whole thing was a publicity stunt. But none of that mattered to Amora as she stood in front of the mirror in the small upstairs bedroom she had slowly made her own. Her dress was simple, off-white linen with lace along the sleeves, borrowed from an old box in the attic. She had woven a few wildflowers into her hair, and though her hands trembled as she pinned them in place, her eyes were steady. She wasn't scared of commitment. She was scared of being seen and still not accepted. But as she looked at her reflection, she saw a woman who had built a life from the ashes, who had planted roots in soil that once tried to push her out. Downstairs, John waited in the garden, where a few rows of chairs had been set up between the apple trees. The ceremony was small, only a handful of people were invited. John's old friend from high school. The fire chief who had cleared Amora's name. A kind woman from town who once left a warm pie on their porch without a note. But the air was tense. No music played. The preacher stood quietly at the front, flipping through his worn Bible. Amora stepped outside, her feet bare on the grass, and walked toward the man who had once simply said, "You need a place to stay." That sentence had turned into something more. Now she was choosing to stay not out of necessity, but love. As the vows were spoken, the clouds overhead began to shift. The wind picked up, rustling the trees, and the scent of the earth rose around them. It wasn't grand. There were no flowers flown in, no photographers, no champagne towers. But there was truth. John looked into her eyes and said, "I don't promise perfection. I promise honesty. I promise space when you need it and arms when you don't." Amora took a breath, her voice calm. "I don't promise to forget what brought me here. I promise to carry it with grace. I promise to walk beside you, not behind you, not in front." They kissed softly, and the wind calmed. People clapped politely. Someone whistled. It felt real, not rehearsed. But just as the guests began to gather for coffee and warm bread under the trees, a car pulled up at the edge of the property. It was old, dusty, with peeling paint. A tall man stepped out, dark-skinned, mid-30s, with a long coat and a tired expression. Amora froze as soon as she saw him. Her breath hitched, and her smile disappeared. John noticed immediately. "You know him." She nodded, eyes locked on the man as he walked toward them, each step slow and deliberate. When he reached them, he spoke with a voice Amora hadn't heard in years. "I wasn't sure it was really you until I saw the photo in the paper," he said. "You look the same. Still stubborn. Still too proud." The crowd fell silent. John moved closer to Amora, protective. She stepped forward instead. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her tone flat. The man looked around, then down at her hands, now joined with John's. "I came to tell you the truth. I was the one who signed you up for that site. The mail-order bride service. I needed money, and I thought if you got picked, we'd both win." A collective gasp rippled through the small group. Amora's mouth fell open. "You sold me." He shook his head. "It wasn't like that. You said you wanted a better life. I found a way. You just didn't know the whole story." John stepped forward, fists clenched. But Amora held up a hand. "Why now?" she asked. Lumen sighed. "Because when I saw that article, I realized what I ruined. I didn't think you'd make it. But you did. And I needed you to know. I'm sorry." She stared at him, not with anger, but disbelief. Years of silence. Years of wondering why it had all started the way it had. And now, on her wedding day, the truth finally walked through the gate. She didn't yell. She didn't cry. She turned back to John, looked into his eyes, and said, "We can't control where we come from. Only where we go next." Then she looked back at the man and said, "I forgive you. But you need to leave." He nodded once, slowly, and walked back to his car. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting golden light across the field. Amora returned to her place beside John. They didn't speak of what just happened. There would be time for that later. For now, they held hands and watched the sky change. The wind returned, soft this time, as if the land itself had exhaled. The guests began to talk again, laughter returned in small waves, and music played from a nearby speaker someone quietly turned on. Not everyone in town celebrated the wedding. Some still whispered. Some would never change. But none of that mattered as Amora leaned her head on John's shoulder and smiled, not because everything was perfect, but because it was real and it was hers. She had been unwanted, dismissed, nearly broken. But she had risen. And in a place where nothing had ever been promised to her, she had built something strong from the ashes. What came next, no one knew. But whatever it was, she wouldn't face it alone.